Welcome everyone to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. Tonight we start a new book, the Book of Shoftim, the Book of Judges. So the first thing that we should say is it's not written in the Book of Shoftim who wrote it. So in the Gemara of Bava Batra, around page 15, I believe, there's a whole discussion of who wrote the different books of the prophets and the later writings. And so here, because there's no explicit name of the author, by tradition, it was written by Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet. And of course, he wrote the books of Shmuel, Aleph and Bet. And according to tradition, he also wrote the book of Shoftim. So that's important to say right from the beginning. So tonight we're going to do the first three chapters, and it will kind of set the tone for the whole book of Shoftim. And then there's one particular incident that will discuss in general, but then towards the end of the class, we will delve into it much, much deeper. So the first thing I could say about the first two chapters in the book of Shoftim is that anyone reading it could see that a good part of it is a review of what actually happened in the book of Yoshua. And it's actually very, unclear, the chronology of everything that comes in the first two chapters. We've learned many times that there's this concept called Ein Muktam V'Muchar B'Torah. There is no, an exact translation, there's no before and after in the Torah, meaning there's no necessarily a chronological flow. And many times there are things that happen that are put in different places, and it's not necessarily chronological. I'd say 90 to 95% is, but here it's quite obvious in the first two chapters, because in the middle of the second chapter, it's talking about Yeshua dying, which that's how the book of Yeshua ended. And also talks about how the people followed God the entire time that Yeshua was the leader. And it mentioned again, we'll get to that in a few minutes. And so I'm just mentioning that it's not 100% clear if what is described in the first two chapters is what is happening now or what happened already in the book of Yoshua, but it's being reviewed at this point. So the book begins with Yehuda, the tribe of Yehuda, and some of the wars that they fought. What we mentioned in the book of Yeshua was the goal or the ideal was that all of Israel, all 12 tribes together would fight the wars of the conquest of Eretz Canaan together, and then everyone would inherit and go to their appointed inheritance. But it didn't turn out that way. They were able to conquer certain of the areas, but as the book of Yeshua made clear, and also here, especially in the first two chapters, it mentions pockets of different nations that remained in the land that Israel was not able to defeat. And so here, the book of Shoftim begins with Yehuda and some of the wars that he fought with the Canaani and the Perizi. And here, it mentions that he fought with Shimon. And we learned already in the book of Yeshua that Shimon's inheritance is within the borders of Yehuda. And here we see it wasn't like all of Israel came at that point. Remember, we're after 14 years, 7 of war and 7 of inheritance. So 14 years have gone by from the beginning of the book of Yeshua to where we are at the beginning of Shoftim. And as I just said, some of the first two chapters is actually going back to parts of the wars and the conquest. And so we see that throughout the book of Shoftim, there are many wars that are fought, unfortunately. And we see that it wasn't that all 12 tribes participated in all of the wars. Many of them what we'll call local. They were happening either up north or down south. And therefore, the tribes that were immediately affected would band together and fight the war. Sometimes they needed more help. They would send out a call for the other tribes to join them. So here we see Yehuda and Shimon. They fight a number of different wars to secure their inheritance. And here there's a story of one of their opponents was led by Adoni Bezek. That was his name, Adoni Bezek. It's interesting that the Israel Electric Company today is called Bezek. So, and Bezek means lightning. So here, they fought a war against Adoni Bezek, and they defeated him. And it says that they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. So when you first read that, if you don't continue with the story, it's like, that sounds kind of cruel, sounds kind of torturous. But then it explains that Adoni Bezek himself says, he says, just like my custom was when I would defeat an enemy, I would cut off their thumbs and their big toes. And he says, now I see, because I did that, it is coming back in a certain way to haunt me. Here we see, this is a perfect example of what's called mida keneged mida, a measure for measure. But here it's Adoni Bezek who recognizes this. And so therefore we understand why Israel did that to him. And then he was killed. But here's an example of not only a measure for measure, but a person recognizing and audibly expressing that, even to the ones who are doing it to him. He understands in a deep way, why this is happening to him? Because that was his practice. Now it's come back upon him. And then it says that Yehuda fought in Jerusalem, and he fought in Hebron. And then, as I said, part of it is from the book of Yeshua. We learned a whole story of how Caleb conquered the area around Hebron, and that was his inheritance. And we learned this already, and it's almost an exact review of, he said, anyone who can destroy Kiryat Sefer, anyone could defeat Kiryat Sefer, which apparently then was near Hebron, I will give my daughter to him to marry. And so the one who defeated Kiryat Sefer was Othniel. And we'll see that the reason that it's probably being repeated here, because it goes a little bit further and tells about Othniel. But we learned that on the simple understanding, the literal meaning, Othniel defeats Kiryat Sefer, and therefore he marries the daughter of Caleb. But the sages say there's another level of understanding here. Kiryat Sefer means literally the village or the place of the book. And we had learned that when Moshe died, 3,000 halachas were lost. But even Yeshua, who sat in Moshe's tent for virtually the whole 40 years, is not his private tent, but his tent of learning, and where he addressed the people and people came to ask him questions. Nonetheless, even he lost 3,000 halachas. And we're told that Otniel was the one, through, he obviously was a genius. He was able to recapture, reformulate, understand those halachas that have been lost. And so it retells the story here, but it goes on to say that he became judge, and he was the main leader in Israel. In those days, at that point, there was no king, and there weren't official prophets yet. The judges were the leaders. They did judge, just like the simple word means. They were the judges of the time, but they were also the leaders. And so Otniel, because he was able to bring back these 3,000 halachas, he was tremendously respected, and he led Israel. So last week we had a whole discussion, and I shared on the WhatsApp group a link to a site that told the whole history of Tzfat and many, many interesting things that we discussed. And I mentioned that in the book of Yeshua, at that moment, I couldn't find it, that Tzfat was mentioned as one of the cities that was defeated. But my surprise was that it was in the part of a country that was not where Tzfat is today. And we've made mention of this many times, that so many of the places mentioned in Yeshua, we're going to see also in Shoftim, in Shmuel, are the names of places today. Some of them are in the exact or very near the original places of where these places are named, and others were just taken and used and had nothing to do with the geography of when they're originally mentioned. So here in the book of Shoftim, here it mentions Tzfat again. So here I just want to read the introduction to it. So first it says something very interesting. It says, and this is in the 16th verse of the first chapter of Shoftim. It says, U'bnei Keni choten Moshe alu me'ir atmarim et bnei Yehuda midbar Yehuda asher b'negev arad v'yalech v'yashev et ha'am. So here it says, we learned that Yitro is in a way considered the first convert. He converts right before the giving of the Torah. He is Moshe's father-in-law, and he previously was a high priest of idol worship. And he joins the Jewish people. And then, according to tradition, he went back to Midian. He was from Midian, and he converted many of the people of Midian. And they came and they settled in Israel. And that's what it's saying here. Those who followed Yitro settled in Israel. It's important to note that the Druzim, a very important minority in Israel, they have a tradition, a very strong tradition, that they, as a people, go all the way back to Yitro. All the way back to Yitro. So here we see that it says, and the Keni, that was the name of the people who followed Yitro, the father-in-law of Moshe. They came up from the city of the date palms, Many people think that that's Jericho. And they came and they settled in the inheritance of Yehuda that was in what we call now the Negev, the southern part of the inheritance of Yehuda. And here it mentions Arad, one of the cities that exists today in the Negev. It's approximately 10 kilometers north east of Beersheba is Arad, and it's in the vicinity of the original Arad mentioned here. And that's where they settled. That's where the followers of Yitro settled. And then it says, Vayelech Yehuda et Shimon achiv, v'yachu et HaKanani Yoshev Tzfat. So it says that Yehuda, along with Shimon, his brother, came and they attacked the Canaanites who were living in Tzfat. V'yacharimu ota, v'yikra et shem ha'ir Charma. And they, in a sense, renamed the city of Tzfat to be Chorma. And here, though, we see clearly that Yehuda is down south. He is fighting down south, and yet that's where the Tzfat comes from. The original mention of Tzfat. So last week I couldn't, on the spot, couldn't find the source, but here it repeats it, and I just wanted to point that out. Anyone who is on the WhatsApp group can see the link that I sent about the whole history of Tzfat, including how it became a holy city and when, and its name, and all of that. And then it says that Yehuda fought in Yerushalayim, and the Yevusi were there at the time. And later, it was only really totally conquered at the time of David. David was the one who turned Yerushalayim into the capital of Israel, ad hayom hazeh, until this very day. Now, in the 22nd verse, it tells a short story, and now it's the tribe of Yosef that are now fighting for their inheritance. So it says, V'yalu Beit Yosef, Gam hem Beit El, the Hashem imam. So it says that Yosef went up, also them, to Beit El, and God was with them. And then I'll just tell you, and what happened is this city of Beit El was, I'm going to read it. Vayatiru Beit Yosef, Beit El, v'shem ha'ir lifnim Luz. And it says that they spied out this city, and the name of Beit El previously was Luz. Now this is the place I'm going to come back to at the end of the class, to try to discuss what is this city Luz. It comes up in the Torah many, many, many times. So here, this one incident goes that they couldn't find a way into the city. It was very well protected, and they found someone leaving the city, and they basically said to him, if you teach us how to get into this city so we can conquer it, we'll save you and your family. Very, very similar to the story of Yeshua and Rachav in the book of Yeshua, that's how they were able to spy out Jericho. And Rachav helped them, and she asked in exchange that her family is saved. Here they offer, if you show us the way into the city, we will save you and your family, and that's what happened. And then it says that he left, and according to the commentaries, he went far away from Israel. And it says he went to the Eretz Hachitim, the land of wheat, and he built a city there, and he called it Luz. And that's its name until this day. But the commentaries point out this is not the same Beit El Luz that we're talking about in the story. He went away with his family who was saved. But since he is originally from Luz, he built a city and he called it Luz. We want to go back later and understand what is important about Beit El. And it mentions over and over again that originally it was called Luz. Then towards the end of the first chapter, so it mentions that a number of the different tribes, Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, that they got their inheritance, but they could not completely conquer the people there. And so in each of these cases, it says that the people continued to live there. And sometimes they would pay like taxes to the tribe because the tribes ruled, but not completely. And so the first chapter ends by making it clear that even though we had fought the war for 7 years, and further in the process of the inheritance, still there were peoples of the 7 nations that were left in Israel. The second chapter begins with saying that an angel comes and rebukes Israel for not driving these people out, for not completing the conquest of Israel. And in the Torah, it says a number of times that when you come into the land, if you don't conquer it completely, they will be like stickers in your eyes. It will be a constant source of problems for you. And we're going to see soon how that began. And in a certain way, it's continued throughout history. And so the question is, why didn't God help them drive the people out? And that is a question we asked last week. And truthfully, it's one of those questions that is somewhat existential, that we can't find easy answers for, because sometimes, as we just learned, God was with them and they were able to conquer Beit El. But what about all the other places that they weren't? And so we'll see there's a bit of a paradox here, because we learn that the whole time that Yeshua is leading them, the people were following the Torah. And so the question is, why weren't they able to defeat the peoples there? And why didn't God help them? But here we'll find an answer soon. But this goes very much with a very important general principle that we see throughout the Torah, that even when God does miracles and wonders, he needs human agency. When Moshe stood at the burning bush and he argued with God for, according to Rashi, an entire week, even though the conversation is recorded in the Torah seems like it was all one conversation. But according to Rashi, it went on for a whole week, a whole dialogue. It's actually one of the longest dialogues in the entire Tanakh between God and a human being. And one of the claims that Moshe made was, God, you're going to do the plagues. You're going to bring us out of Egypt. You're going to do all the miracles of conquering the land. What do you need me for? What do you need a human leader for? And God didn't answer directly, but it's obvious that God was giving over. The general principle is God always needs human agency. And that's why each one of the plagues, God says to Moshe, go to Paro and warn him, or you or Aaron strike your staff on the water, or whatever it was that was always coming through Moshe. Even the splitting of the sea, there's three main ideas of on what merit did the sea split. One is, it says explicitly that God said to Moshe, take your staff and hit the water and it will split. The other one is the very well-known midrash that Nachshon ben Aminadav jumped into the water because they were surrounded and people were like crying, what are we going to do? The Egyptians are almost here. And he went into the water until it came up to his nostrils, and then it split. This is like the epitome of faith. And the other one is that it was on the merit of the bones of Yosef that they had taken out, because Yosef had made the other brothers promise that when they come out of Egypt, they would bury him in Israel. But each one of them, there was some human agency through which God did the miracle. And here we learned in the book of Yeshua that the wars ended after 7 years because Israel just had run out of steam. They just didn't have it in them anymore to fight anymore. And so here we can answer in a way that's one of the reasons that God didn't come and just do it, because God just couldn't do it. He needed Israel to be the vessel for that to happen. And so in 1 minute, we're going to see a second reason. And that is that at the beginning, and so this angel comes and he rebukes the people. And it says that the people cried, and they called the place Bochim, which means then they crying. Bocha means to cry. So they named the place where this angel came. The question is asked, do we know who this angel was? Some opinions was it was literally an angel who came and spoke. It's not clear to whom, but the other opinion is that it was actually Pinchas. And here he's called an angel. And I remember learning in Parshat Vayishlach, where it says that Yaakov sent malachim to Esav. He wanted to make peace with him. And so literally, you can translate malachim in two ways. Most translations says Yaakov sent messengers, malachim. That is what an angel is. An angel is a divine messenger. But Rashi says just 2 words, malachim mamish. He sent angels, real angels. Now, is that a contradiction that he sent human messengers? No, not necessarily. Because we learned just recently that when choosing a teacher, a Rav, the sages say, if he doesn't appear to you like an angel, then choose someone else. In other words, your feeling from your Rebbe, your teacher, your Mashpia, your Rebbitzin, whoever it is, they have to appear to you like an angel. So here it could have been a real angel, or it could have been Pinchas, who was like an angel. He had that kind of a reputation. And then in the 7th verse of the 2nd chapter, it mentions that Yeshua dies. And as we said right at the beginning, it's not 100% clear the chronology of these first two chapters. And it mentions again this idea that was already mentioned, that just like it already mentioned in the book of Yeshua, that Yeshua died. But here again, it mentions the whole time, that whole generation was loyal to the Torah. But then, starting in the 12th verse, the theme of the whole book of Shoftim is given over. It's over many, many verses. But it says like this, and we're going to see this repeat itself over and over and over again. It says that the next generation rose up and they turned away from God. They turned away from the Torah. They began worshiping idols. They began to intermarry with the peoples that were still there. And God became very angry, and he sent an enemy against them. And then, again, we'll see this theme repeats itself over and over and over again. God sends an enemy, and the enemy defeats Israel, rules over them for different amounts of time, till the people cry out. The implication is that they realize their mistakes and they cry out, and God sends a redeemer. Those are all the judges that we're going to be learning about in the book of Judges. It's a string of judges who rise to the occasion once Israel is being defeated by enemies that were brought upon them, it says by God, but we can interpret it just as well, because in the Torah itself, especially the book of Devarim, it says over and over again that as long as you follow God, follow the Torah, do the mitzvah, set up a just society, you'll have everything. Your enemies, you won't even have enemies. No one will be able to even touch you. But if you turn against God, then the rains will stop, the enemies will come, and you'll be driven from your land. And so here in the book of Shoftim, we see it very, very clearly. And that's the beginning of the second chapter. It explains this whole idea. And it's a simple formula. When the people turned away from God, God, as it were, turned away from them, and enemies came. The people cried out. God awakened or brought a redeemer and saved Israel, and then they would rule. Sometimes it says, and then there were 40 years of peace. There were 80 years of peace, and then another generation would come. They would turn away from the Torah, they would worship idols, they would intermarry, and the same cycle repeats itself over and over again. So that theme is introduced in the second chapter, and it takes almost the entire second chapter. And then in the third chapter, and I'm going to do this relatively quickly because I want to get a little bit back to Luz. So in the third chapter, it says, in the first verse says, Ve'ela hagoyim asher hinich Hashem lenasot bam et Yisrael et kol asher lo yadu et kol milchamot beCanaan. That these are the peoples that remained in the land, and in the next few verses, it makes clear that they were there in a certain way, at a spiritual level, to test Israel. Are you going to follow God, or are you going to follow these people and their ways and their gods? So in the beginning, it says that the people began worshiping idols and intermarrying, and it uses the language, God sold them to Kushan Rishatayim. That was the name of the, the leader. And it says that he ruled over Israel for 8 years. And here, I'm mentioning about the chronology, because here it says that the first of these judges that God elevates to save the people was Othniel. Now, we already learned about Othniel in the book of Yeshua. He's already basically a repeat in the first chapter, but here, in more of a chronological level, Othniel now becomes the main judge, and he is able to turn Israel back to God, and he's able to defeat Kushan Rishatayim. And then it says, this is the first time it says, and it will say it a number of times in the book of Judges, that afterwards the land rested for 40 years. There was peace for 40 years. That's like a whole generation. And Othniel ruled most of that time. He was really the first of the judges, was Othniel. And it says in the 10th verse, it says that that God was with the ruach of Othniel. And a very similar thing will be repeated with Shimshon, with Samson, where it says that God was with the spirit. He enlivened Shimshon. So here it says, one second. So it says, "Vatihi alav ruach Hashem, v'yishpot Yisrael," that God enlivened the spirit of God filled Othniel, and he judged, and he went to war, and he was able to defeat Kushan Rishatayim. But in the 6th verse, it says actually very clearly this idea of God testing Israel. In the 6th verse of the 3rd chapter, it says, "Vayu lenasot bam et Yisrael, ledat hayishma'u et mitzvot Hashem asher tziva et avotam biyad Moshe." That this whole cycle of exile and redemption, of being defeated and then being redeemed, it says it was all a test that God was sending to see if the people would follow him and the mitzvot that he had given to their fathers through the hand of Moshe. And then the rest of chapter 3 is after those 40 years of peace with Othniel, then Eglon, the king of Moab, he came against Israel, and he ruled for 18 years, which is a substantial amount of time. He was ruling over Israel. And here, the second of we'll call it the redeemers and the leaders, was Ehud. Ehud, it says, when it first describes him, that he had a lame right arm. It doesn't explain how he got it or exactly what the lameness was, but it was apparent that it was like very obvious, like he couldn't move his arm. It was like limp. And so Ehud came up with a plan. It's so relevant to many of the things that have been happening in the last 3 months here in Israel, the different strategies Israel has been using to defeat our enemies. So he came up with a plan that at first it said he made a double-edged sword, and he put it under his clothes in his right thigh. And he brought a gift. Apparently, Israel had to bring gifts or taxes to the king. And so he was the one who brought it. And he brings it to the king. And it describes the king as being incredibly overweight. Ehud brings this gift, whatever it was, and he says to Eglon, he says, I have a message from God for you. And it says that the king got up. I'll finish the story and I'll come back to this. It makes a point that the king got up to hear the message from God. And so Ehud came close to him. And because it was actually easier for him to draw the sword from the other side than to try to do it from his left side. That's why it makes a point that he put it on his thigh on the right side. He pulled out this knife. It wasn't like a huge sword, it was a knife. And he stuck it in the belly of the king. And it says that the king was so fat that the knife just went in and the fat just kind of swallowed it. And so he couldn't remove it. And he fell and he died. Ehud left and he locked the door and he escaped. When the guards came, it was quiet for a long time and they didn't know what was happening. So they tried to come in and they saw it was locked. So they thought the king was, using the bathroom or something. And they just stayed there for a long time. And then there's something wrong here. And they break in and they see that the king is dead. In the meantime, Ehud escapes. And he obviously had shared his plan with a whole army contingent. And he roused them to attack the Moabites. And they win the battle. And afterwards, again, there is rest in the land for either 40 or 80 years. One second. "80 years after Ehud, there were no enemies. Israel kind of returned to the fold. For 80 years, that's like 2 generations. And that's how the 3rd chapter ends. What's interesting in my preparation, so it says that after Ehud dies, that the head shofet was Elimelech. And that is the beginning of the book of Ruth. The beginning of Ruth begins, Vayehi b'yamei shofet ha-shoftim. And it was in the time that the judges ruled. And that begins the whole story of Ruth, where Elimelech was the leader, and there was a famine, and he left with his family, with Naomi and his 2 sons, and they go, and one of them marries Ruth, and the whole story of the book of Ruth. And apparently, chronologically, that's where it fits in, because when you read the story, you don't know when during the Shoftim did this happen. Not clear. So at least according to the commentary that I read, it was after Ehud passes away, and subsequently there was a famine, and Elimelech, he was the leader, but he left. He didn't want to bear the burden of the people. So that's the first 3 chapters. With the time remaining, I want to go back to this incident where Yosef conquers Bet El, and it was called Luz previously. So very quickly, this comes up many, many times in the Torah, and there are many mysteries about this place called Luz. The first time it's mentioned is in the dream of Yaakov, when he dreams of a ladder that stretches from the earth to the heavens, and angels ascending and descending. When he wakes up, so he says, this is the house of God. And he called it Bet El, the house of God. But the Torah says, but previously, this place was called Luz. Later, when Yaakov returns after marrying Leah and Rachel, and Bilhah and Zilpah, all the children, he comes back. It's last week's Parsha, and the whole incident with Esav and fighting with the angel, what happened with the rape of Dinah in Shechem. After the rape of Dinah in Shechem, he goes back to Beit El, and there God confirms that his name is now Yisrael. But there it mentions that he returned to Bet El, and it was previously called Luz. Later, when Yaakov is sick, the end of his life, he calls Yosef, and he gives a recap of what happened with Yosef's mother, with Rachel. And he mentions this whole idea of coming to Bet El. And again, it mentions that previously it was called Luz. So the whole question is, what is this place, Luz? So in the Gemara, actually, I'm sorry, it's in the Midrash, Bereshit Rabbah. So it says, it talks about Luz. And it says a number of things about Luz. First of all, it says that they made the techelet, the blue for the thread of the tzitzit, in Luz. Now, that's where they produced it, but it's from a shellfish, and the shellfish was in the Mediterranean. But according to tradition, they would catch this shellfish that had in its body like a blue dye, but where they produced it in mass was in Luz. They also say that when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah and the surrounding area, he destroyed the temple. He took over Yerushalayim, but he could not defeat Luz. They said the same thing about Sennacherib. Sennacherib was the Assyrian leader who took away the 10 tribes, and he almost took Yerushalayim also. Said he couldn't defeat Luz. And then there's a tradition that no one died in Luz. That if someone was about to die, he would go out of the city and he would die and be buried then. That there wasn't an energy of death in Luz. And one other thing they say about Luz is that people of Luz didn't lie. They always were truthful. And one last thing, this is many of the things I just said, many people don't know. But the one thing that many people do associate Luz with is called the Luz bone. It's the bone, and there's actually a disagreement. The Zohar says it's the bone at the bottom of the spinal cord, of all of the bones that make up the spine. It's the bottom one, and that it's indestructible. The Arizal said it's the top bone where the knot of the tefillin sits. Is the very top of the spinal column, and that is the luz bone. So to put all this together, it's like a lot of different ideas about this place called Luz. But there is we'll call it a common theme that runs through this, is the idea of the ability to take physical and make it spiritual, and to take the spiritual and to make it physical. So I'm doing this fairly quickly, but one of the things they say about Techelet is why is there a blue thread on the tzitzit? On each of the 4 strands of 8 tzitzit, 32 altogether, on a 4-cornered garment, and 7 of them were white and 1 was blue. And so the sages say, Techelet domeh liyam, yam domeh l'rakia, rakia domeh l'kisei hakavod. Techelet, this color blue, is like the sea. The sea is like the heavens. The heavens are like the throne of glory. In other words, here we have the stream of consciousness. Here we have a physical blue thread, and it begins to remind us of very spiritual things. The water, for all of you who have not gotten the book yet, the spiritual nature of water. Water connects us to spirituality. And the Rakia, the heavens, of course, represents spirituality. And that reminds us of the throne of glory. So here we see this idea of from physical to spiritual. In Yaakov's dream, he has it in Beit El. He calls it Beit El, the house of God. But we see that he was able to take the dream, which is very spiritual, and he took the principles that he learned from the dream, and he integrated into his physical actions in this world. And that's why one of these things I didn't mention is that when Yaakov complains to Lavan that I've been watching your sheep for all these years and you have not paid me anything near what it's worth to you. And so Lavan said, well, what do you propose? So he proposed this whole idea, and Lavan thought he was an absolute fool, that he's not going to get anything from his own plan. But in Parshat Vayetze, it explains in great detail how he was able, through very wise breeding tactics, to get the sheep to turn out to be striped and speckled and spotted. And one of the ways he did it is he took rods and he, like a barber shop, he stripped it in like a spiral, and then he put them by the where the sheep would eat and drink, and the sheep would be startled by this, and then the males would mount them and they would give birth. Why am I telling you all this? Because it says in the Torah specifically there were 3 types of trees that were used. This is a whole Torah in itself. I'll just mention it. One of them was called luz, which today we translate as a type of a nut, perhaps a chestnut. It's not clear exactly, but it was luz. So here again, Yaakov is taking spiritual concepts and applying them in a physical way. This whole idea that Nebuchadnezzar and Sennacherib could not defeat Luz, no one would die in the city. This whole idea of there's this eternal energy. And that's the connection with the loose bone. It's said that the loose bone, when a person is buried, that bone is never destroyed, even though by natural means, all of the bones will eventually disintegrate into the earth, or even in a casket. Here in Eretz Yisrael, the body is directly into the earth. It's the Holy Land. And so here's the loose bone. Again, this idea that even in death, something will remain. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, very fascinating, said that this idea of the loose bone is the secret of cloning. That if you only have a little bit of DNA, you can, in theory, not in theory, they've done it, that you can produce a whole animal, a whole being from just the basic DNA. So that's the same concept, at least, of the loose bone, that something remains of a person. And it's with this loose bone that we'll have the resurrection of the dead. So here we see, and of course, the dream of Yaakov was connecting heaven and earth. The latter was connecting earth and heaven, physical and spiritual. And he called it, this is the house of God. And that's where physical and spiritual would meet. God is infinite, and yet he wants a physical place where he can interact with human beings, with his creation. And that's the important reason given why God created the world. That God had a desire to have a dwelling place in the lower worlds. So we see that this place, luz, it hints to, it alludes to this kind of eternal energy, an energy that can take physical and turn it into spiritual, can take spiritual concepts and have it integrated into the physical world, that it can even supersede death itself, and alludes to the ultimate resurrection of the dead, Techiyat HaMetim. Okay, may we all have the ability to transform physical to spiritual and spiritual to physical, and may we see Mashiach, the world, Techiyat HaMetim, and the world to come, soon and in our days.